There are mornings that change your entire life, and you don't realize it until years later when you're looking back through the haze of everything that followed. This was not one of those mornings. On this particular morning, Thelma Dunlap knew exactly what was happening. She just hadn't decided yet what she was going to do about it. She sat alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. This kitchen, 30 years of meals cooked in this kitchen, 30 years of Thanksgiving turkeys and Saturday morning pancakes and late night conversations with Clayton over glasses of wine that turned into 2 glasses, then 3, then the kind of quiet where two people who have loved each other long enough don't need to say anything at all. She had scrubbed these counters 10,000 times. She had replaced the faucet twice and the tile floor once and the curtains 4 times because Clayton always hated the ones she picked, and she always picked them anyway. Lester Oro, she would leave this kitchen for the last time. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not in your mind, but in your bones. But we need to go back. We need to go back 16 days before this kitchen and this cold coffee, back to a Thursday morning in late September when the air in Oregon was just beginning to carry that first metallic edge of autumn. Clayton Dunlap died on that Thursday morning. He was 74 years old. Thelma found him in the kitchen, and the detail that would stay with her for the rest of her life was that he was still standing. His right hand was reaching for his coffee mug on the counter. His left hand was at his side. His eyes were open. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes and told her it was sudden cardiac arrest, as if giving it a clinical name would make the image easier to carry. It didn't. But here is what Thelma knew that the paramedics didn't. Clayton had been carrying something heavy in his chest for longer than any cardiac condition. In the last 3 months of his life, he had developed a habit of sitting on the back porch of the condo, staring at the lake without speaking, sometimes for an hour or more. Thelma would bring him coffee, and he would take it without looking at her, and she would sit beside him and wait for whatever he needed to say. He never said it, except once 3 months before he died, when the evening light was turning the lake that particular shade of copper that only happens in Lake Bridget. Clayton had taken your hand, squeezed it harder than usual, and said something that Thelma replayed in her mind so many times afterward that the words wore grooves into her memory. "Thelma, if something happens to me, call your grandfather's lawyer before you call Forrest." She had asked him why. He didn't answer. He looked at the lake. He changed the subject. And Thelma, because she was a woman who had spent 46 years trusting her husband, assumed he was talking about estate planning, about practicalities. She did not think deeper. She would spend many nights in the months ahead wishing she had asked again. After Clayton's body was taken away, after the neighbors came and went with their casseroles and their careful faces, after the house finally emptied and Thelma was alone for the first time in 46 years of marriage, she sat on the edge of the bed they had shared and opened the nightstand drawer on Clayton's side. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was looking for him, for some trace of the man who had been reaching for his coffee 12 hours ago and was now nowhere. She found his reading glasses, his blood pressure medication, a receipt from the hardware store dated 3 weeks earlier, and tucked beneath the receipt a small piece of paper folded into quarters. Clayton's handwriting, but shaky, the letters unsteady, in a way she had never seen in 46 years of grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional love note tucked into her suitcase when she traveled for the catering business. 4 words: Lighthouse, ask Leland, sorry. Thelma stared at the note for a long time. Leland, her grandfather, had been dead for 20 years. Ask him what, and sorry for what? She put the note in her wallet next to the brass compass Leland had given her the last time she visited the lighthouse when he was 84 and she was 52, and he still walked the cliff path every morning like a man who had made a deal with the ocean to stay alive as long as he kept showing up. "Keep this," he had said, pressing the heavy brass instrument into her palm. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." She had carried it ever since, assuming it was sentimental, a keepsake, an old man's way of saying goodbye. The funeral was organized by Forrest. Thelma's son was 46 years old, managed a regional logistics company, and had inherited his father's talent for appearing competent in moments that required emotion rather than efficiency. He wore a dark suit. He spoke for exactly 4 minutes at the podium, hitting every expected note of grief and gratitude, without once losing the composure that Thelma had come to understand was not strength, but armor. He shook every hand in the room with the precise warmth of a man who understood the social currency of sorrow without actually spending any of his own. Thelma stood beside the casket for 3 hours. Her feet ached. Her chest felt hollowed out. But she stood because that is what you do. You stand and you thank people, and you hold yourself together until you can fall apart somewhere private where nobody is watching. It was Lorraine who broke the surface first. Forrest's wife, 44 years old, a woman whose blonde hair was always precisely arranged and whose sentences always sounded like they had been reviewed by legal counsel before leaving her mouth. Lorraine found Thelma in the hallway of the funeral home during a gap between visitors. She touched Thelma's arm with 2 fingers, a gesture calibrated to express concern without actual warmth. "Thelma, I know this isn't the time, but there are some documents Clayton signed before he passed that you should know about. We want to handle everything transparently." Thelma looked at her daughter-in-law. "What documents?" "Forrest will explain after the funeral." Lorraine returned to the reception room, and Thelma stood alone in the hallway with a damp tissue in her hand and a feeling she couldn't name settling into the bottom of her stomach like a stone dropping into still water. 20 minutes later, Harriet arrived. Thelma's daughter was 38, perpetually late, perpetually apologetic, and on this particular day her eyes were red, but not from crying. From sleeplessness. Harriet had the look of someone who had been staring at a ceiling for 3 nights, running, arguing with herself about something she couldn't resolve. She hugged Thelma at the entrance, and she held on longer than usual, the kind of hug that is not greeting, but confession. Then she pulled back and said quietly, urgently, "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." Before she could continue, Forrest appeared. He placed his hand on Harriet's shoulder. Not a comforting hand, a controlling hand. "Not now, Harriet." Harriet looked at her brother, then at the floor. She said nothing more. Thelma watched this exchange and filed it in the part of her mind that had been keeping records of things that didn't feel right for longer than she wanted to admit. The hand on the shoulder, not protective, directive, she would remember it. There was one other thing she didn't notice at the time but would remember later. A man she didn't recognize, older, wearing a clean but well-worn jacket, standing in the last row of seats during the service. He didn't speak to anyone. When the service ended, he placed a small envelope on the condolence table and left without a word. Thelma wouldn't open that envelope for weeks. When she finally did, she would find a photograph inside, a younger version of her grandfather, Leland, standing in front of the lighthouse, arm around a man she had never seen. On the back, in faded ink, Leland and Calloway Sr., 1978. But that was later. First, there was the meeting. 16 days after the funeral, Forrest sent a text message, not a phone call. "Mira, how are you doing, Mom?" A text message with a time and address and the words, "There are things we need to discuss regarding Dad's estate." Thelma drove to Forrest's house, the house she and Clayton had helped with the down payment on 14 years ago when Forrest was 32 and just starting at the logistics firm, and Thelma had written a check for $40,000 without hesitation, because that is what mothers do. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front door. Something in her chest was tightening, the same feeling she got when the weather turned wrong and the barometric pressure dropped before a storm. She went inside. She sat at his marble dining table, the one Lorraine had chosen during a renovation that cost more than Thelma's first car. Forrest sat across from her. Lorraine sat beside him. Between them on the table, a printed agenda, bullet points, section headers, an agenda for the dismantling of Thelma Dunlap's life, formatted in 12-point font with half-inch margins. "Mom," Forrest began, "Dad had a lot of assets and we want to make sure everything is handled correctly." Thelma nodded. She knew about the assets. She had helped build them. 46 years of shared life, shared work, shared sacrifice. The condo was paid off. The catering business was profitable. She had kept the books herself for 22 years. There were investments, retirement accounts, money they had saved by skipping vacations and wearing the same winter coats for a decade. "The condo," Forrest said. "Dad put it in my name about 9 years ago after his first cardiac episode. It was an estate planning decision." "I know he talked about it," Thelma said carefully. "So legally it's mine now." He didn't look away. He looked uncomfortable, which she supposed was something, but he didn't look away. "Lorraine and I have been thinking, and we believe it might make more sense for you to have a smaller space, something easier to manage. There's a beautiful senior community in Ashford." "I'm 72, Forrest, not 92. "Nobody is saying you can't take care of yourself, Thelma." That was Lorraine, the rehearsed voice. "We just think something more supportive might be appropriate at this stage." Thelma let the phrase "at this stage" sit in the air for a moment. Then she moved on. The business. A glance between husband and wife. The kind of glance that has been practiced. "We transferred the operating assets into Lorraine's LLC 6 months ago for liability protection. The business continues, it just operates under a different structure." "You moved my business into your wife's company." "We secured it," Forrest said. Thelma sat very still. 22 years. Every event she had planned. Every Saturday morning loading vans at 5 a.m. Every relationship she had built with venues and vendors and clients who came back year after year because they trusted her name, her handshake, her word. She had built that business the way you build something you love, slowly, carefully, with everything you have. "The car," she asked. "Harriet needs it for the kids' school run. We'll arrange ride shares for you." Thelma asked one more question. She asked it quietly, without inflection, the way you ask something when you already know the answer will hurt. "Forrest, when you transferred the catering business into Lorraine's LLC, did you ask my opinion?" Silence. Lorraine looked at Forrest. Forrest looked at the papers in front of him. Thelma understood. Clayton may not have signed those papers willingly, or he may have signed them without fully understanding what he was signing in those last months, when his mind was clouding at the edges and his hands shook when he reached for his coffee. She didn't say this out loud. She filed it where she filed everything else. "Is there anything left?" she asked. Forrest shuffled his papers. "There's the Lighthouse property, Grandpa Leland's place up in Crestfall on the coast." Lorraine made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "That place. The county has been sending notices. Back property taxes, something like $14,000. The main structure is condemned. It's basically a liability." "How much is it assessed for?" Forrest checked his phone. "Less than the taxes owed. Nobody would buy it. There's nothing there, Mom, just rocks and a broken building." Thelma nodded once. "I'll take it." Forrest blinked. "Take what?" "The lighthouse, the property, I'll take it." Lorraine set down her pen. "Thelma, there's no water hookup. The cottage roof has partially collapsed. You said it's mine. My grandfather left it to me, not to a trust, not to an LLC, to me." Neither of them argued. Why would they? They had taken everything that had an obvious price tag. The lighthouse was a burden, a liability, a crumbling building on a cliff that nobody had visited in 15 years. Let the old woman have it. Let her figure out what to do with $14,000 in back taxes and a condemned building on a piece of rock overlooking the Pacific Ocean. When Thelma stood to leave, Harriet, who had been sitting silently through the entire meeting, spoke. "Mom, let me drive you home." Forrest said her name, just her name, Harriet, and Harriet looked at her brother, then looked down and said nothing more. Thelma left alone. She walked to the driveway and reached for her keys before remembering the car was no longer hers. She called a taxi, and she stood on the front steps of her son's house, the house she had helped buy, and waited 20 minutes in the dark for a ride to a motel she hadn't booked yet. That was the moment it became real. Not the words at the table, not the agenda with its bullet points. This, standing outside keyless in the dark waiting. In the taxi, Thelma looked out the window at the city she had lived in for 30 years. The streetlights passed over her face in slow intervals. She was 72 years old. She had raised 2 children, built a business, stood beside her husband for nearly half a century, cooked 10,000 meals, and the sum total of all of it was that she was sitting in the back seat of a taxi because she no longer had a car heading to a motel, because she no longer had a home with $53 in her wallet, because she no longer had a bank account she could access. She did not cry in the taxi. She cried at 2 in the morning alone into a pillow that smelled like commercial laundry detergent in a motel room 6 blocks from the condo that no longer had her name on the door. She cried until her chest hurt and her eyes swelled and the pillow was wet on both sides. Then she stopped. Not because the grief was finished, but because she was tired of giving it to a room that didn't care. She stayed at that motel for 2 weeks. The room cost $39 a night, which meant her $53 lasted exactly 1 night with change left over for a vending machine coffee in the morning. On the second home, she walked to the bank where she and Clayton had kept their joint checking account for 30 years and asked to withdraw $200. The teller, a young woman who recognized her, typed for a moment, then looked up with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional. "Mrs. Dunlap, this account was closed 3 weeks ago. The funds were transferred to a new account." Thelma asked whose name was on the new account. The teller couldn't say. Thelma already knew. She found an ATM for the small savings account she had opened years ago for the catering business Petty Cash. There was $1,100 in it. Nobody had thought to touch it because nobody had known it existed. $1,100 and a brass compass. That was the full inventory of what remained of 46 years of marriage and 22 years of building a business from a folding table in her garage. She ate toast in the mornings because the motel had a continental breakfast that came with the room, and toast was free, and free mattered now in a way it had never mattered before. She watched the news because the television was there and silence was worse. She said nothing to anyone because there was no one to say anything to. Her friends were Clayton's friends. Her social life had been the catering business. Her family had just divided her assets over a printed agenda at a marble dining table. On the 4th morning, she walked to the public library. She sat at a computer terminal and searched for elder financial exploitation and then adult children taking parents' assets, and then what to do when your family takes everything. The results were overwhelming. Thousands of stories. Thousands of women, mostly women who had woken up one morning to discover that the people they had spent their lives caring for had quietly, legally, methodically stripped them of everything they owned. There was even a word for it that Thelma hadn't known: financial elder abuse. She read for 3 hours. She didn't feel better. but she felt less alone in her specific kind of ruin. On the sixth day, Harriet called, not Forrest. Harriet, the call lasted 40 seconds. Mom, are you okay? Where are you staying? Thelma told her the name of the motel. Harriet was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Thelma heard everything her daughter was not saying. Then Harriet said, I'll come see you tomorrow. She didn't come tomorrow. She didn't come the day after. On the eighth day, Thelma stopped expecting her to. Forrest texted twice, once to ask if she had contacted the senior community in Ashford, once to forward a brochure for a place called Sunrise Crest that advertised a garden terrace and weekly bingo. On the ninth night, Thelma could not sleep. She sat on the edge of the motel bed at 1 in the morning and pulled out Leland's brass compass. It was heavy. The numbers engraved on the case she had always assumed were the coordinates of the lighthouse. She had checked them once on a map years ago. They matched. She had thought that was the whole story. But tonight, for the first time, a different question formed in her mind. Why would you engrave coordinates on a compass? A compass tells you direction, not destination. Unless the person who gave it to you wanted it to do both. Unless he was telling you not just which way to go, but where to arrive. She opened her wallet. Clayton's note. Lighthouse. Ask Leland. Sorry. The photograph from the funeral envelope, Leland and a stranger, 1978. And the compass in her hand pointing north as it always did, patient and steady and waiting for someone to marry them. 3 pieces. She didn't know what picture they made, but they all pointed to the same place. On the 15th morning, Thelma packed her bag. She walked to the bus station. She bought a one-way ticket to the coast. The ticket cost $47, which left her with just over $1,000 in the petty cash account and nothing else in the world except what she could carry. The bus took 4 hours. She sat at the window and watched the city dissolve into highway. The highway dissolve into forest, and the forest thin out into the gray-green scrub of the Coast Range. A woman across the aisle, younger maybe 50, was reading a paperback and eating trail mix from a Ziploc bag. She offered some to Thelma without speaking, just held the bag out. Thelma took a handful. The woman went back to her book. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for Thelma in 2 weeks, and it cost nothing, and the woman probably forgot about it before the next chapter. Thelma would not forget. She thought about what she was doing. She was 72 years old, riding a Greyhound bus toward a piece of property she hadn't visited in 15 years, with no job, no home, no car, and a bank balance that wouldn't last 2 months. If Forrest could see her now, he would consider it proof of everything he believed about her mental state. And maybe he would be right. Maybe this was what decline looked like from the inside, a series of decisions that felt clear and necessary to the person making them and appeared irrational to everyone watching. Or maybe this was what freedom looked like. She wasn't sure yet. She supposed she would find out. The bus crossed into the Coast Range around noon. The trees changed. Douglas fir and western red cedar closed in on both sides of the highway, and the light shifted from the flat brightness of the valley to something filtered and green and ancient. The air coming through the bus vents smelled different, wetter, older, like soil that had been accumulating for centuries without anyone asking it to account for itself. The town of Crestfall was small enough that the bus stop was a painted bench outside a bait shop. Thelma stepped off the bus into a wind that tasted like salt and distance. She walked into the shop and asked for directions to the old Pennington Lighthouse. The woman behind the counter looked at her. Bridget Thornberry, 63, sun-weathered face hands that had been baiting hooks and selling tackle for 30 years. Leland's place up on the North Bluff. Nobody's been up there in years. She studied Thelma's face. You family, his granddaughter. Bridget looked at her a moment longer than necessary. You look like him. Around the eyes. As Thelma stepped outside, a man at the bar next to the shop called after her. Lester Cranston, 55, tan skin polo shirt with a real estate company logo. The Lighthouse property, I've had my eye on that land for a few years now. If you're looking to sell, I could put together a fair offer, save you the trouble of those back taxes. Thelma turned and looked at him. I haven't even arrived yet, and you're already trying to buy. Just a friendly offer, ma'am. That property isn't easy to live on. From inside the shop, Bridget's voice carried through the open door. Leave her alone, Lester. Thelma walked. The last mile and a half was unpaved, climbing the bluff in slow switchbacks, with the ocean wind pushing against her from the left, steady and constant, as if testing whether she was serious. Her bag was heavy on her shoulder. Her knees ached on the switchbacks. She was 72 years old, and she was walking uphill on a dirt road toward a building that had been condemned by the county, and the only plan she had was a set of coordinates engraved on a brass compass in a dead man's note that said sorry. When the path finally leveled out at the top of the bluff, she saw the lighthouse for the first time in 15 years. It was worse than she remembered. The keeper's cottage, a 2-story stone building that had been Leland's home and workshop for 6 decades, had lost most of its roof on the east side. The interior was open to the sky. The lighthouse tower itself was intact, but the door had warped in its iron frame, and the gallery railing was rusted nearly through. The fog signal building beside it had collapsed inward like a body folding in on itself. But the stone walls were 18 inches thick, and they had not moved. The foundation was solid, and the view. The Pacific Ocean spread out in every direction, gray and enormous, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened to Thelma Dunlap in the last month. It did not care about her condo, or her business, or her bear, or her son's marble dining table. It was just there the way it had been there when Leland climbed these stairs every morning, the way it would be there long after all of them were gone. Thelma set her bag down on a flat rock and looked at it all. $14,000 in back taxes, a ruined cottage, a lighthouse nobody had turned on in 20 years, and in her pocket a brass compass with numbers that might mean something more than coordinates. She looked up at the tower. The iron door was sealed shut, a rusted padlock visible even from this distance. She had been carrying the compass for 20 years without ever trying those numbers on a lock. She picked up her bag and walked toward the cottage door. It opened. Leland had never locked the cottage. Only the lighthouse tower had a lock. He used to say that a building that keeps people out is a building that has already given up. She stepped inside into 15 years of coastal damp and decay. Salt crystals on the windowsills, mold climbing the lower walls. A section of the kitchen ceiling had collapsed, bringing plaster and 2 rafters down across the counter. But the stone walls were untouched. The fireplace was intact. And in the back room, Leland's study, the bookshelves still held their rows of volumes behind glass doors that had kept out the worst of the moisture. Thelma stood in the ruined kitchen and looked up through the collapsed ceiling at a square of gray October sky. She had $53. She had a bus ticket stub. Her son had her home, her daughter-in-law had her business, and her daughter had her car. But she was here, and for reasons she could not fully name, standing in this broken building on a cliff above the Pacific felt more real than anywhere she had stood in the last 30 days. She didn't know yet what was waiting for her at the top of the tower behind a rusted padlock, whose combination she had been carrying in her pocket for 20 years. She didn't know about the vault, or the paintings, or the letter with her name on it, or the fact that her grandfather had spent 60 years building something in secret that would change everything. All she knew was that she was here, and that was the beginning. On the 3rd morning, Thelma woke to someone knocking on the cottage door. She'd been sleeping in Leland's study on the old leather sofa beneath 2 wool blankets that smelled like decades in dust, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the ocean. Then she heard the knocking again. She opened the door and found Bridget Thornberry from the bait shop standing on the step with a cardboard box in her arms, canned food, a propane camp stove, a box of matches, two additional wool blankets cleaner than the ones Thelma had found inside, and a handwritten note on a piece of lined paper torn from a school notebook. Leland was good to this town. Welcome back. Thelma stood in the doorway holding the box for a long time after Bridget left. She didn't know who had told Bridget she was living up here. She hadn't told anyone. In a town the size of Crestfall, she supposed you didn't have to. She set up the propane stove in the study. She heated a can of soup and ate it sitting on Leland's sofa with the blankets around her shoulders and the wind doing its work against the walls outside. She had not eaten a hot meal in 2 days. The soup tasted like survival, which is a flavor you don't recognize until you need it. By day 5, she had cleared the kitchen enough to work in it. She swept plaster and broken wood into piles, stacked the fallen rafters against the west wall, scrubbed the counter with water she carried up from the spigot at the base of the bluff. It was hard work. Her back seized on the second hour. Her hand blistered on the broom handle. She was a woman who had spent 22 years managing a catering operation, which meant she knew physical labor, but knowing it at 52 is different from doing it at 72. The body keeps a different ledger at this age, and every entry costs more than it used to. That afternoon, a woman appeared on the bluff path, 70 years old, silver hair, cut short, wearing a fleece jacket that had been washed so many times it had gone soft as felt. She walked with the particular steadiness of someone who had spent her life making decisions that other people had to live with. "You must be Leland's granddaughter," she said. "I'm Vivian Winslow. I live about 2 miles south along the ridge. I suppose that makes me your nearest neighbor if you're generous with the word." Thelma wiped her hands on her jeans. "Thelma Dunlap. I know. Leland talked about you. For 30 years he talked about you." Vivian looked at the cottage with the evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to assessing situations. "He said you were the only one who understood him. I always thought that was sentimental until I watched you carry those rafters by yourself for the last hour." "You were watching. I walk this ridge every morning, have for 15 years. Saw the smoke from your stove 2 days ago and figured I'd give you some time before introducing myself." She paused. "I should tell you something useful about myself. I was a judge, retired now. I don't practice anymore, but I know the law, and I know the people around here who are worth trusting. If you need either of those things, you know where I am." She left without asking why Thelma was there, without asking about family or finances or plans. She simply offered what she had and walked back along the ridge toward her own solitude. Thelma watched her go and thought, this is a woman who understands that some questions are not yours to ask. On day 7, Lester Cranston came back. He drove up the unpaved road in a white SUV with his real estate logo on the door, which meant he wanted Thelma to know exactly who he was and what he represented. He stepped out carrying a manila folder and the kind of smile that men use when they believe they are being reasonable, and the person they're talking to simply hasn't understood the situation yet. "Mrs. Dunlap, I don't want to make your life difficult." He held up the folder. "This is a copy of the county's condemnation notice. Your cottage has been flagged as a public hazard. Under county code, the property owner has 90 days to bring the structure into compliance, or the county can order demolition. I can buy the land right now, deduct the back taxes from the price, and you walk away with a little cash in your pocket. Better than losing everything to a bulldozer." Thelma took the folder. She opened it. She read the notice carefully while Lester stood on her doorstep with his hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels. Mr. Cranston, she said, closing the folder. This notice authorizes remediation, not demolition. The county can order demolition only if the owner fails to begin structural repairs within the 90-day window and demonstrates no intent to comply. I've already begun repairs, and I have every intent to comply. Lester's smile thinned. With respect, ma'am, the kind of repairs this place needs aren't exactly a weekend project. No, Thelma said, they're not. Good day, Mr. Cranston. She closed the door. She stood behind it with the folder in her hand and her heart beating fast, not from fear, but from the particular surge that comes when you realize you are capable of something you weren't sure about until the moment arrived. She had read the county building codes at the Crestfall Public Library on day 4, sitting at a table in the single-room operation run by a woman named Nadine, who had been the librarian for 31 years and who had simply pointed Thelma to the right shelf without asking why she needed it. The next morning, day 8, Thelma walked into the hardware store in town to buy a shut-off valve for the water main. $22. And that is where she met Lowell Calloway. Lowell was 68 years old, retired from 30 years as a marine contractor, and he spent his retirement haunting the hardware store the way some men haunt fishing piers or coffee shops. He was there every morning when the doors opened, wearing the same canvas jacket, drinking coffee from a thermos he brought from home, and offering unsolicited but consistently accurate advice to anyone who walked in with a project that looked too large for one person. He looked at the valve in Thelma's hand. That's a $20 part. What are you putting it on? A lighthouse cottage up on the North Bluff. Lowell set down the caulking gun he had been examining. He looked at her the way people look at someone when they are deciding how much truth to share. Leland Pennington's place. You're his granddaughter. Thelma, he told me about you 10 years ago before he got bad. He said his granddaughter was the one who understood things. Lowell paused. He said it like a man delivering a fact, not a compliment. Something moved through Thelma's chest that she couldn't name. Not grief, not gratitude. Something older than both. He never told me that. No, I don't imagine he would have. Lowell helped her install the valve that afternoon. He came back the next morning with 2 men he had worked with for decades, and the 3 of them spent a week stabilizing the east wall of the cottage and patching the roof with materials they sourced at cost from a supplier in the next town over. On the 3rd day of work, Thelma asked him the question she had been holding. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Lowell was standing at the edge of the bluff looking out at the water. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had a different quality, lower, less casual. Leland came to my father's funeral 23 years ago, drove 3 hours each way, sat in the back row, didn't say much, didn't have to. He turned to face her. Some debts you carry forward, you don't repay them to the person who earned them. You repay them to whoever shows up next. That evening, after the other men had left, Lowell and Thelma sat on the cottage steps. The sun was going down behind a bank of clouds, and the light was the color of old brass. Lowell poured coffee from his thermos into 2 cups and handed her one without asking if she wanted it. My wife died 5 years ago, he said. My son lives in Seattle. He calls once a month, 8 minutes. I've timed it. He looked at the coffee in his hands. I come to the hardware store every morning because if I stay home, I have to look at the empty chair on the other side of the kitchen table. 34 years I sat across from her at that table. Now I sit across from nothing. Thelma didn't offer comfort. She didn't say she understood or that it would get better, or any of the things people say when someone opens a door they usually keep closed. She just poured more coffee. Sometimes that is enough. On the 11th night, lying on the sofa in Leland's study, Thelma pulled out the funeral photograph, Leland and the Stranger, 1978. She tilted it toward the flashlight she kept beside the sofa. And for the first time in the weak yellow beam, she saw something she had missed. Below the date in smaller handwriting, faded almost to nothing, lower level year completed. Lower level. Year completed, 1978. The hatch beneath the lighthouse was built in 1978, and Lowell's father had helped build it. Lowell had not appeared at the hardware store by coincidence. He had been waiting. She put the photograph down. She looked at the ceiling. Lester Oro, she would climb the tower. She had been avoiding it for 12 days, and she had told herself it was because the cottage was the practical priority. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was that the tower frightened her, not physically, but in the way that an unopened letter from someone you loved frightens you. Because once you open it, whatever is inside becomes yours, and you can never go back to not knowing. Day 12. Thelma stood at the base of the lighthouse tower and looked up. The iron door was warped in its frame. She worked at it with the pry bar for 20 minutes, her shoulders burning rust, flaking onto her hands and her jacket. When it finally gave with a sound like a gunshot, the interior exhaled a breath of brine and iron. The spiral staircase was original to the 1887 construction. Cast iron bolted to the central column, circling upward into darkness. It rang beneath her feet as she climbed. Each step a bell struck in a church she hadn't entered in decades. Halfway up, her knees locked. She gripped the railing and stood still, breathing hard, looking up at the remaining turns of the staircase above her. The voice in her head, the one that sounded like Forrest, the one that had been telling her what to do for years, said, "This is foolish. You are 72 years old. You should be in Ashford. You should be in the garden terrace. You should be playing bingo." That voice was loud. It had always been loud. But there was another voice, quieter, steadier, the one that had told her to buy a one-way ticket, the one that had told her to read the county building codes, the one that had told her to say, "I'll take it," at Forrest's dining table. That voice said nothing. It just waited for her to keep climbing. She climbed. The lantern room opened above her when she pushed the hatch. Light poured in from every direction, gray and silver and enormous, filtered through glass panels fogged with salt but unbroken. And in the center of the room, mounted in its original housing above the lamp mechanism, sat the fourth order Fresnel lens, intact, pristine. A museum piece that had never left its post, still refracting the light the way it had been designed to do 139 years ago. Thelma turned slowly, looking out through the glass at the Pacific in every direction. The ocean was a living thing from up here, shifting in muscular patterns visible in the current that you could never see from the bluff below. She could see the curve of the coastline for miles in both directions, and the horizon line where the water met the sky was so clean it looked drawn with a ruler. Then she looked down. Set into the iron floor of the lantern room just below the lens housing was a steel plate, rectangular, heavy, secured with a padlock that had rusted to the exact color of the floor around it, invisible unless you were looking for it. And Thelma was looking because the photograph had said lower level, and the compass in her pocket had numbers engraved on its case that she had never tried on any lock. She knelt. She turned the dial on the padlock, matching the numbers from the compass. Her fingers were steady. The cylinder resisted, then turned, then clicked. The lock opened. Below the steel plate, a ladder descended into darkness. Thelma went back down the tower stairs, out the door, and across the bluff to the cottage. Lowell was sitting on the steps drinking coffee. She did not explain. She said, "Come up, I need someone to see this." Lowell followed her without a question. The space below the lantern room floor was perhaps 15 feet square. The walls were poured concrete sealed against moisture. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams. A small ventilation system hummed in one wall, drawing power from the lighthouse's automated electrical connection, still running after all these years, because it had been built by someone who intended it to last. And filling every wall on purpose, built wooden shelving were flat cases, dozens of them. 64 Thelma would count later, each sealed with a combination of wax and hardware clasps, each labeled in Leland's careful hand. Lowell lifted a case lid. Inside, cradled in custom-cut foam, were paintings, oil on canvas, oil on board, watercolor on heavyweight paper, each sleeved in archival plastic before being laid in the foam. Not prints, not reproductions, original works. Thelma lifted the nearest painting and held it to the flashlight. A coastal landscape, Pacific rocks, morning fog, a quality of gray-green light that she recognized because she had been seeing it every morning for 12 days from this exact bluff. She turned it over. On the back, in Leland's handwriting, HW 1962, Crestfall, North Bluff. 64 cases, 8 to 10 pieces per case, more than 500 paintings. 6 decades of work created in secret, preserved with extraordinary care and shown to no one. Thelma sat on the concrete floor with her back against the shelving and the flashlight across her knees. She did not cry. What she felt was larger than tears. It was the slow, profound shock of realizing that the person she thought she knew best in the world had lived an entirely separate life beneath her feet. Leland had been a lighthouse keeper. He had also been an artist, not a hobbyist, not a man who sketched on weekends. An artist who had chosen anonymity for 60 years and built a climate-controlled vault under his lighthouse floor to house the evidence. In the center case eye-level back wall, she found an envelope. Her name in Leland's handwriting, 6 pages, dry preserved, waiting for her. Leland had started painting seriously after the war, he wrote. He came back from Korea with a way of seeing that the doctors gave a clinical name, and he called simply the way things are now. An attentiveness so acute it was almost painful. He picked up a brush because he needed somewhere to put all that looking. He discovered he was good, not hobbyist good. He studied through a correspondence course. He worked with a painter in Portland for 2 winters. He submitted work just once, to a regional exhibition in 1959. A judge pulled his painting from the general submission and hung it on the featured wall. A dealer from San Francisco approached him afterward and offered to buy the entire series. Money that would have changed his life. Leland said no. He went home to the lighthouse and thought about it for 3 days. And then he wrote in his journal, a green-covered notebook Thelma would find on the bookshelf, that he understood something. The moment he sold the work would stop being what it was. It would become a product. And then he would have to produce. And then he would stop truly seeing, because he would be looking for what sold instead of what was true. And then a passage that Thelma read twice. I kept this secret not only for the art. I kept it because I was afraid. Afraid that if anyone knew, they would look at me differently, would want something from me. And I spent my whole life avoiding that. But Thelma, keeping everything to yourself is not protection. It is just another kind of selfishness. I hope you do better than I did. The final paragraph, you were always the one who came to see me, not because you had to, just because you wanted to. That is everything, Thelma. She folded the letter. Lowell stood at a respectful distance, his flashlight aimed at the ceiling so the light wouldn't intrude. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Later, back in the study, Thelma found the green-covered journal on the bookshelf. She opened it to a bookmarked page and found an entry from 15 years ago, the day Clayton had visited the lighthouse alone. Leland had written, Thelma's son-in-law came today. He asked about the property. I did not show him the vault. I showed him the view from the lantern room, and he looked at the ocean and said, "This place is worth real money if someone knew what to do with it." That was my answer. He will never be the one I trust. Thelma closed the journal. The pieces assembled themselves. Clayton had come here 15 years ago. He had asked about the property. Leland had measured him and found him wanting, and Clayton, who must have sensed that something was hidden, but never learned what had written his dying note. Lighthouse, ask Leland, sorry. Sorry for asking the wrong question. Or sorry for never protecting Thelma from Forrest. Or both. She went outside. Lowell was on the steps. She looked at him directly. "You knew about the vault." Lowell met her eyes. No flinch. "My father poured the concrete in 1978. He told me before he died if Leland's granddaughter ever comes help her, don't tell her about what's below until she finds it herself. Leland wanted you to find it, not to be led to it. You waited 12 days. You needed 12 days to be ready." He paused. "Think about what would have happened if someone told you on day one, a woman who just lost everything arrives at a broken building, and a stranger says there are 500 paintings worth a fortune hidden under the floor. What would you have done?" Thelma knew the answer. She would have called Forrest. She would have called because that was the reflex sharing good news with family. And Forrest would have had lawyers involved before she understood what she possessed. "Your father built the vault," she said. "He and Leland. Took them 6 months. Dad never told anyone except me, and only on his deathbed." Lowell looked at the tower. "That photograph I left at the funeral, that was my way of saying I'm here when you're ready." Thelma wanted to be angry. She'd been deceived, managed, led along a path someone else had designed. But the anger wouldn't hold, because the path had worked, because she was standing on the other side of it, with her eyes open and her mind clear, and 500 paintings at her back, and if anyone had told her what to do, she would have done the wrong thing. In the weeks that followed, Thelma worked with a precision she hadn't felt since running the catering business at full capacity. She drove to the county seat and found the law firm Leland had mentioned in his letter. The original partner was long retired. His daughter had taken over a woman in her late 40s who found Leland's file in 20 minutes and explained the trust structure, once clearly irrevocable, predating Thelma's marriage, holding the Lighthouse property, and all contents for her sole benefit, amended in 2003 to explicitly include artistic works. Everything in the vault belonged to her. No one, not Forrest, not a court, not anyone could touch it. Lowell connected her with Dr. Fay Pemberton, a retired art historian from the university in Eugene, who now lived 40 minutes down the coast. Dr. Pemberton entered the vault on a Wednesday morning with a portable lamp and a magnifier, and did not emerge for 2.5 hours. When she climbed the ladder back into the lantern room, she sat down and looked at Thelma without speaking for a long moment. Who knew about this? No one, until now. 500 pieces. 60 years of continuous practice. The development across the chronology is remarkable. She paused. This is a major find. 30 years in this field, and I have never seen anything like it. Dr. Pemberton estimated the collection's value at $15 to $25 million. She recommended patience a measured approach, institutional interest before commercial sale. She wanted to begin public outreach immediately. Thelma refused. My grandfather kept this secret for 60 years. I can keep it for a few more months until I understand what I want. They agreed on a private sale, 12 to 15 pieces to two collectors Dr. Pemberton trusted. The first him to Broma $310,000. Thelma paid the $14,000 in back taxes. She opened a bank account in Crestfall. She hired a contractor for the cottage. She bought a 7-year-old Honda with a dent in the rear quarter panel and good tires. She kept records of everything, every dollar, every invoice. every conversation. A paper trail that said to anyone who cared to read it, this woman knows exactly what she is doing. She did not rush the cottage. She had spent 22 years in the catering business, learning that the difference between adequate and excellent is patience, and she applied that same principle to the restoration. The contractor replaced the roof with steel panels rated for coastal wind loads. Thelma chose the color herself, a dark gray that would weather into the cliff rather than fighting against it. She had the windows reglazed with double panes. She had the electrical system brought up to code by a licensed electrician from the next town who drove 40 minutes each way and never once asked why a woman her age was living alone in a lighthouse cottage on a cliff. The kitchen she did mostly herself. She found a counter at a salvage yard in town, solid maple from a restaurant renovation, scarred and stained in ways that told a story she appreciated. She sanded it by hand over 3 days, working in the mornings when the light came through the east windows, stopping in the afternoons when her shoulders told her to stop. She installed it with Lowell's help, the two of them working in the companionable silence of people who understand that not every shared task requires conversation. She developed a routine: morning's coffee at the kitchen table, then walked the bluff path that Leland had walked every day of his last 30 years. The path ran along the cliff edge for half a mile before curving inland toward the tree line, and from it she could see the full sweep of the coastline, the lighthouse behind her, the town of Crestfall below, and to the south, the ridge where Vivian Winslow took her own morning walks. Sometimes they would see each other from a distance and raise a hand, nothing more, two women on parallel paths who had both chosen solitude and understood its terms. Afternoons she spent in the vault cataloging. She had bought a notebook and begun her own inventory, recording each painting by case number, dimensions, medium, date, and subject. She did this slowly, one case per day, spending time with each piece the way you spend time with a letter from someone you miss. She was getting to know her grandfather through his brushstrokes, and what she found was a man far more complex than the one she had visited on summer holidays. The early work from the 50s was controlled and precise landscapes rendered with the careful attention of someone still learning to trust his own eye. By the 60s, something had loosened. The colors deepened. The compositions grew bolder. And by the 70s and 80s, Leland had found a language entirely his own, a way of painting coastal light that made the fog look like it was breathing. Then the silence broke. Forrest noticed when the county property tax records updated. He had flagged the lighthouse property expecting a forced sale. Instead, he found taxes paid current and a structural repair permit on file. He called Thelma. She let it ring. He called again. His voicemail said he was confused about her situation, about her decision-making. Confused. She recognized that word. It was the word people use when someone stops being controllable and they need a clinical justification for why. Forrest found Lester Cranston. Lester told Forrest what he wanted to hear, that Thelma was living in a condemned building, spending money from unknown sources, and that a male neighbor was spending a suspicious amount of time at the property. Forrest heard exploitation. Forrest heard vulnerability. Forrest heard a reason to take action. Rosalind Ellsworth, a 34-year-old reporter for the Crestfall Courier, published a short piece about an elderly woman occupying a condemned coastal property. Her source was Lester Cranston. Vivian Winslow read the article over breakfast and called Rosalind before noon. "You wrote a story about a woman you never spoke to based on a single source who is actively trying to buy her land. Is that journalism, or is that public relations for Lester Cranston?" Rosalind went quiet. Then she asked, would she talk to me? Thelma told Vivian after. Not yet. November brought the storm. Thelma woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the roof groaning. Wind at 70 miles per hour, horizontal rain, the kind of coastal storm that arrives like a fist and doesn't open its hand for 12 hours. Water was coming through the east roof, the section that had been patched streaming down the interior wall toward Leland's study, where Thelma had moved 8 cases of paintings for Dr. Pemberton to photograph the previous week. She dragged the cases out of the study one at a time. Each case weighed 30 to 40 pounds. She carried them through the dark cottage, through water running across the stone floor into the front room, where the ceiling was intact. The 6th case was the heaviest. She lifted it, felt her knee give, and went down. The case hit the floor. She hit the floor. She lay on her back in an inch of water with rain coming through the ceiling onto her face, and she stayed there for a moment that stretched into something longer than a moment. Am I foolish? The question arrived without warning. Is Forrest right? Should I be in a facility somewhere with a garden terrace and a schedule and someone who checks on me twice a day? She lay there. The water was cold. Her knee throbbed. Her palms were bleeding where the rough wood had scraped them. She was 72 years old, lying on the floor of a building that had been condemned by the county in a storm alone at 2 in the morning. Then she got up. She opened the case, checked the paintings, undamaged. She dragged the last 2 cases to safety, changed into dry clothes, made coffee, and sat in the kitchen until dawn. When Lowell arrived at 6, driving through the tail of the storm because he had heard the forecast and driven anyway, he found Thelma at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the 8 cases stacked neatly against the far wall. Are you all right? The roof needs to be redone, steel this time. Lowell looked at the cases. He looked at her hands, which were wrapped in dish towels. He looked at her face, which was calm in a way that is only possible on the other side of a decision that could have gone differently. He nodded. He didn't ask what the decision had been. He could see it. 3 months after Thelma arrived in Crestfall, the process server found her at the cottage door. He handed her an envelope and drove away. She stood on the bluff in the December wind and read it. Forrest and Harriet were petitioning for a declaration of diminished capacity and the appointment of Forrest as conservator of her estate, including the Lighthouse property and all contents. The petition cited her age, her sudden relocation, her financial transactions of unclear origin, and her alleged susceptibility to exploitation by unknown third parties. Thelma read it twice, then she folded it. That night, Harriet called. Her voice was thin. Mom, Forrest made me sign. He said if I didn't, he'd cut me off from everything. I have 2 kids, Mom. I don't have anywhere else. Thelma was quiet for a long time. You signed? Yes. Then this is something you'll have to live with, Harriet. I won't hate you for it, but I'm not going to tell you it's all right. She hung up. She put the kettle on. She called Lowell. I need your help, she said. And I'm going to need the lawyer. She paused. And Lowell, I need you to tell me everything your father said about the vault. Everything. Lowell was silent for a moment, then, Dad said there was one more case, one that Leland hid separately, not on the shelves, behind the ventilation panel on the north wall. Thelma looked toward the tower. The wind was howling outside and the lantern room was dark against the sky. What's in it? He didn't know. He just knew Leland put it there last after everything else was done. He said Leland called it the proof. The morning after Lowell told her about the hidden case, Thelma climbed the tower before dawn. She brought a screwdriver, a flashlight, and the particular kind of calm that settles over a person who has stopped being afraid of what she might find. Fear is a luxury. Thelma had spent it all in a motel room 3 months ago and had been operating on something leaner ever since. The ventilation panel on the north wall of the vault looked like every other part of the system. Functional, ordinary. The kind of thing your eyes slide past because it belongs there. 4 screws held it in place. Thelma removed them one at a time, her fingers steady, and set the panel on the floor. Behind it, a shallow cavity in the concrete wall, just deep enough for a single wooden case smaller than the others. She lifted it out and set it on the floor beneath the portable lamp she kept in the vault now. She unclasped it. Inside, no paintings. 3 letters on cream stationery dated 1959 from the San Francisco dealer who had offered to buy Leland's work. Not just a polite inquiry. The letters documented a specific offer for 30 paintings, a sum that, adjusted for decades of inflation, would be equivalent to roughly $2 million today. The dealer's language was urgent, almost reverent. He had written that he had not seen work of this caliber from a living American painter in over a decade. Beside the letters, a 4-page written evaluation from the judge of the 1959 regional exhibition. The assessment called Leland Pennington, one of the most important and unrecognized voices in American coastal painting of the 20th century. The handwriting was precise. The language measured the kind of professional opinion that carries weight in courtrooms and auction houses and the offices of museum curators. This was not a compliment from a friend. This was a verdict from an expert rendered 67 years ago, preserved in wax and foam in a hidden compartment behind a ventilation panel at the top of a lighthouse on the Oregon coast. And beneath the letter and the evaluation, a single painting, smaller than most of the others in the collection, a self-portrait. Leland sat in the lantern room, afternoon light falling through the salt-fogged glass onto his shoulders, and he was looking straight out of the canvas. Not at the ocean, not at the horizon, at whoever was standing in front of the painting. At Thelma. She held it under the lamp for a long time. She had photographs of Leland black and white images from the 60s and 70s where he stood in front of the lighthouse squinting into the sun, looking like what he was, a keeper. A man who maintained things, but in this painting, he had shown himself as what he also was, an artist, a man with something to say who had chosen silence, and then at the very end left one image that said everything. Here I am. This is what I saw. This is who I was when nobody was watching. Thelma wrapped the painting carefully and carried it down the ladder out of the tower and into the cottage. She set it on the kitchen table next to the banker's box she had been assembling for the past week. Then she called Dr. Pemberton. I found provenance documentation. Original from 1959. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. What kind of documentation? Dealer correspondence, exhibition evaluation, and a self-portrait. Dr. Pemberton arrived the next morning. She read the letters. She read the evaluation. She looked at the self-portrait for a very long time without speaking. When she finally set it down, her hands were not entirely steady. With these documents, we don't need to build provenance, she said. Provenance has been sitting here since 1959. The evaluation alone would establish Leland Pennington's place in the historical record. And the self-portrait, she paused. The self-portrait changes the entire narrative. This isn't a collection of work by an unknown painter. This is a deliberate artistic choice. He knew what he had, he chose to keep it, and he left the evidence for someone he trusted to find it. Thelma said, I'm ready. You can begin the catalog. But the name stays right. Leland Pennington, Lighthouse Keeper. Not Leland Pennington, Hidden Genius. Not Leland Pennington, Undiscovered Master. He was a man who kept a lighthouse and painted what he saw. That's the story. Dr. Pemberton nodded. That's a better story than anything I could have invented. Thelma had 3 weeks before the hearing date. She used them the way she had once used the 3 weeks before a 200-person catering event, with absolute precision. Every task sequenced, every contingency mapped, every detail documented. She drove back to the city and saw her doctor, a woman who had treated her for 18 years. Full cognitive assessment. The results were unambiguous. Her physician wrote a clear professional statement of Thelma's mental fitness, noting that her recall, reasoning, and executive function were consistent with the woman 2 decades younger. She accelerated the second private sale in coordination with Dr. Pemberton. 20 additional paintings to 2 vetted collectors under signed confidentiality agreements. $420,000. She paid the Lighthouse property tax forward 5 years. She deposited $60,000 into a documented preservation fund for the collection. She kept the remainder accessible and recorded. Then she prepared the timeline, every decision she had made since arriving in Crestfall, in chronological order, with supporting documentation for each one. Lowell sat across the kitchen table from her while she talked through it, not coaching, not scripting, just listening while she arranged the facts until she could present them without hesitation and without emotion. Forrest is going to say you came up here because you weren't thinking clearly, Lowell said one evening. I know. What's your answer? Thelma thought about it, not for effect, genuinely. The truth is that my children took everything they could legally take, and this was what was left. I didn't come here confused. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and then nowhere became somewhere. The night before the hearing, Thelma sat at the kitchen table with the banker's box open in front of her. She arranged the documents the way she used to arrange a catering service, knowing which course comes first, which is the centerpiece which leaves the lasting impression. Medical records at the front, trust documents next, bank statements, invoices, the complete timeline. Dr. Pemberton's assessment with the dollar figure redacted, but the professional evaluation intact. Vivian Winslow's sworn affidavit at the back, the anchor. Her lawyer had reviewed the order that afternoon and looked at Thelma with an expression that was not quite surprised but close to it. You've done this before. 22 years of event planning. I know how to tell a story with sequence. She closed the box. She set the self-portrait on top, face down where only she would know it was there. Leland looking out of the canvas. Leland watching. The courthouse was 45 minutes inland, in the county seat, a brick building with high windows and the permanent smell of floor wax and old paper. Thelma drove herself in the Honda. She wore a navy wool coat she had bought second-hand in Crestfall. Leland's compass was pinned to the lapel. Lowell had offered to come. She told him to stay. This was between her and her children. The courtroom was small. Judge Sinclair, mid-50s, reading glasses on a cord, the look of a man who has heard too many families tear themselves apart over money and property, and the particular cruelty that only people who once loved each other can inflict. He read the petition silently. He asked 2 procedural questions. Then he looked at Forrest's attorney. Counselor, you filed for conservatorship on grounds of diminished capacity. What is your evidence? Forrest's attorney was good. Thelma gave him that. He was a man who understood narrative, and he built it carefully. A 72-year-old widow, recently bereaved, abandons her established life, relocates without support to an isolated coastal property flagged as a public hazard, begins engaging in financial transactions the family cannot account for. The family is concerned. The family believes she may be under the influence of or being exploited by a third party. Here he paused the way a man pauses when he wants the silence to do his work for him. Possibly a neighbor. He presented a document that Thelma recognized. Lester Cranston's property report, the one he had prepared for Forrest during their meetings in Portland. It described the lighthouse as structurally unsound, the cottage as uninhabitable, and Thelma as a vulnerable elderly woman living in conditions that no reasonable person would choose. The attorney read from it, selectively emphasizing phrases like imminent structural failure, an isolated location without adequate emergency services, and no visible means of independent support. Thelma sat still and listened. She noticed that Lorraine was in the gallery, seated 2 rows behind Forrest, her posture rigid, her hands folded in her lap in the way of someone who has invested heavily in an outcome and is watching it play out. Harriet was not in the gallery. Thelma did not know whether her daughter had chosen not to come or had not been told about the hearing date, and she found that the not knowing hurt less than she expected. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and the preparation had done something unexpected. It had made her calm, not the calm of resignation, the calm of a woman who has done her work and trusts it. Thelma kept her face still, but she looked at Forrest. He was sitting behind his attorney in a gray suit, and he was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, and in that moment, Thelma saw something she had not expected to see. Not calculation, not the cold efficiency she had braced for. What she saw on her son's face was fear. She understood it all at once, the way you understand something that has been sitting at the edge of your vision for years and suddenly comes into focus. Forrest was not greedy. Forrest was terrified. He had spent his entire adult life constructing systems of control, his logistics company, his finances, his family, because control was the only thing that made him feel safe. And Thelma, by disappearing from his system, by becoming someone he could not predict or manage, had triggered the deepest fear he carried. He was not trying to take her life away. He was trying to make the world hold still. This did not excuse him, but it let Thelma see the person behind the petition, and the person was her son, and her son was afraid. The judge looked at Thelma's attorney. Response: the banker's box opened. The documents came out in the order Thelma had arranged them, each one placed on the table like a course in a meal she had been preparing for 3 months. Medical records, cognitive assessment, the physician's statement, trust documents, bank statements showing 3 months of deposits, expenditures, and positive balances, every cent documented, property tax receipts, contractor invoices, vehicle purchase record, the complete timeline from day 1 in Crestfall to the week before the hearing. Dr. Pemberton's written assessment of the collection redacted to remove the valuation, but sufficient to establish that Thelma had identified, assessed, and begun managing a significant cultural asset. Vivian Winslow's affidavit, bearing the signature and credentials of a retired judge who had observed Thelma for months and attested to her complete mental competence. Mrs. Dunlap relocated to property she owns outright. Her attorney said, held in an irrevocable trust established by her grandfather. She paid $14,000 in overdue property taxes. She undertook and documented structural repairs. She purchased a vehicle. She opened a bank account and has maintained a documented positive balance through legitimate asset transactions. Her physician certifies her as cognitively sound. A retired judge who has known her for months has submitted a sworn statement attesting to her capacity. She paused. There is no evidence of exploitation, confusion, or incapacity. There is only evidence that she is a competent woman who made decisions her family did not anticipate. Forrest's attorney stood. The source of the funds remains unexplained. The source of the funds is the trust property, Thelma's lawyer said. Mrs. Dunlap discovered assets on the property left by her grandfather, which she has been liquidating through legitimate and documented channels. The judge turned to Forrest. Mr. Dunlap, do you have medical testimony, a physician's statement, any evidence beyond your personal concern? Forrest looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. No, Your Honor. Judge Sinclair removed his glasses. He set them on the bench. He looked at Forrest for a long moment. This petition has no medical foundation. The respondent has demonstrated consistent, documented, competent management of her affairs over a period of several months. The petition is dismissed. He picked up his gavel. I will also note for the record that filing for conservatorship without a single medical opinion is an exceptional waste of this court's time and causes considerable distress to the person named. I would encourage counsel to reflect on that before filing again. The gavel came down. Forrest's face went through three expressions in rapid succession: shock, anger, and then beneath both something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to surface: shame. Lorraine beside him reached for his hand. Forrest pulled away. It was the first genuine crack Thelma had seen in her son's armor since he was 8 years old and his hamster had died and he had cried on her shoulder for an hour. And she had held him and told him it was all right to feel things, and somewhere between then and now he had decided that she was wrong about that. Thelma closed the banker's box. She thanked her lawyer. She walked out of the courtroom. Forrest caught her in the corridor. "Mom!" She stopped. She turned. "What did you find up there?" His voice was controlled, but thin at the edges. "What are these assets?" "Your grandfather's work." "What kind of work?" Thelma looked at her son. She looked at the fear and the shame and the 46 years of choices that had led him to this hallway in a county courthouse, trying to take from his mother the one thing she had left. "Forrest, you're afraid. I know that. You're afraid because you can't control this, and you've spent your whole life controlling everything because it's the only way you know how to feel safe." She spoke without anger, without coldness, with the particular clarity that comes when you have rehearsed nothing and simply tell the truth. "But controlling is not the same as loving. And taking everything I had didn't make you safer. It just made you more alone." Forrest stood still. His jaw was tight. His eyes, which were her eyes and her father's face, looked at the floor. "The door's open, Forrest. Yep, when you're ready to walk through it as my son, not as someone trying to count my assets, it's open. But not before." She walked toward the exit. Harriet was waiting there. She had been crying, not the composed kind. The kind that wrecks your face and your posture and leaves you standing smaller than you actually are. Shoulders curved inward, arms crossed over your chest as if trying to hold something together that has already come apart. Her mascara had run in 2 dark lines down her cheeks, and she had not wiped them away, which told Thelma more about her daughter's state than any words could have. "Mom." Thelma stopped. "I'm sorry." Harriet's voice broke on the second word and did not recover. "I'm sorry I took the car. I'm sorry I didn't fight Forrest. I'm sorry I signed in the petition. I knew it was wrong every single time, and I told myself it was practical that we were protecting you, but we weren't protecting anything. We were just taking." She stopped. She breathed. "The real reason I signed wasn't because Forrest threatened me. The real reason is that I was scared. I lost Dad, and I couldn't lose Forrest too, and I told myself that if I just went along with him, at least I'd still have a brother. But I don't have a brother. I have a man who uses me when he needs a second signature." Thelma looked at her daughter. She did not look for the child she remembered. She did not search Harriet's face for the girl who had spent Saturday mornings in the catering kitchen. She looked at the woman standing in front of her right now in this corridor with ruined makeup and shaking hands, and she saw someone who had finally stopped arguing with herself. "You can come back," Thelma said. "When you're ready to come as my daughter, you know where I am." Harriet nodded. She could not speak. "Go home. Think about it." Thelma walked through the courthouse doors into the afternoon light. The drive back to the coast took 45 minutes. The last stretch where the highway dropped down toward the sea was the part she had always loved as a child, when Leland drove her to the Lighthouse for summer visits. The Pacific appeared around a bend in the road, sudden and vast. She pulled over at a viewpoint she had passed a dozen times without stopping. She turned off the engine and sat with the window down, letting the salt air fill the car. She replayed the hearing in her mind, not the legal arguments, not the judge's ruling, but Forrest's face, the shame, the way he had pulled his hand away from Lorraine. She had spent 3 months preparing to fight her son, and what she had found in the courtroom was not an adversary, but a frightened man in a suit that fit too well, sitting behind a table full of papers that proved nothing except how afraid he was of losing control. She thought about what she had said to him in the corridor. Controlling is not the same as loving. She had said it without rehearsal, and she knew it was true, and she also knew it was the kind of truth that takes years to absorb. Forrest would not hear it today. He might not hear it this year, but the words were in the air now, and words like that have a way of finding their way in, eventually the way water finds cracks in stone. Not because of force, because of patience. She drove the rest of the way to Crestfall without turning on the radio. She stopped at the post office. She wrote a note to Dr. Pemberton on a piece of paper from the counter. Proceed, you have my authorization to begin the catalog and public outreach. But the name stays right, Leland Pennington, Lighthouse Keeper. She mailed it. She drove up the bluff road. She turned off the engine and sat. The winter that followed the hearing was quiet in a way that Thelma had not experienced since childhood. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The quiet of a life that has been stripped down to its essentials and is slowly, carefully being rebuilt. She woke each morning before dawn and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the darkness thin over the ocean. She walked the bluff path. She worked in the vault. She drove to town for groceries and stopped at the hardware store where Lowell was always there drinking coffee from his thermos, ready to help with whatever needed doing next. Vivienne came for dinner once a week. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about law and painting and the particular challenges of living alone on a coastline that was trying to reclaim everything humans had built on it. Vivienne had a dry wit and a habit of saying exactly what she meant, which Thelma valued more than she could easily express. In a life that had been filled with people who said one thing and meant another, directness felt like a gift. On Christmas Eve, Thelma sat alone in the cottage with a fire in the restored fireplace and one of Leland's paintings propped on the mantel. A Winter Seascape, 1971. Gray water, gray sky, and between them a line of white foam that was the only brightness in the entire composition. She had chosen it because it reminded her of where she was in between the old life and whatever came next, between grief and something she didn't have a name for yet, between winter and the spring that was she had to trust on its way. Spring came to the coast, not with warmth first, but with light. The fog burned off earlier each morning. The cliff paths showed new green. By March, the cottage was finished. Thelma had done the kitchen herself, mostly with Lowell handling the heavy work. New counter salvaged from a renovation in town. A proper stove. Walls replastered and painted a color that caught the morning light and held it. She turned 73 in February. Lowell brought a lemon cake from the bakery in town. They ate it at the kitchen table with this door open because the afternoon was warm enough, barely to justify it. Lowell said, "Happy birthday, Thelma." She said, "Thank you, Lowell," and that was enough. Some moments don't need to be more than what they are. Rosalind Ellsworth called. Thelma kept her word. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Rosalind wrote the real story this time, not the short piece from before, a long feature. The woman who lost everything traveled to a condemned lighthouse and discovered that her grandfather had spent 60 years creating a body of work in secret. Rosalind focused on Leland, not on the money, not on the family conflict, but on the lighthouse keeper who painted 500 paintings and showed them to no one. The name Leland Pennington. The words lighthouse keeper, just as Thelma had asked. The article ran in the Crestfall Courier. It was picked up by the Oregonian. Then NPR called. Then two museums. Lester Cranston withdrew his petition to the county board. No public statement. He simply stopped appearing. Vivian told Thelma over coffee, Lester is a practical man. Once the story belonged to the community, he knew he'd never touch that land without becoming the villain. So he walked away. Thelma nodded. She had no interest in Lester Cranston. She never had. In March, Thelma bought the empty storefront on Main Street that had been a hardware store before the new one opened on the highway. $45,000. Lowell and Edmund, a carpenter who had helped with the cottage, spent 6 weeks on the interior. Above the door, a sign, Leland's Place Community Resource Center. Below it, housing support benefits, navigation, legal referral. The idea had come from a conversation in the hardware store with a woman named Colleen Holbrook, 69 years old, widowed. Her adult children had convinced her to sign her house over to them to avoid probate, and now she had no legal claim to the home she had lived in for 31 years. She was staying with a neighbor. She didn't know what to do or who to ask. Thelma had sat with her for 2 hours. I know exactly what this feels like, she said, and she did. The center saw 8 clients in its first week. By the second month, 18 per week. People whose children had taken their homes. Widows navigating estates alone. Veterans who couldn't access benefits. People who had fallen through gaps that Thelma now understood from the inside. She didn't counsel them. She connected them. She made coffee and sat with whoever needed to sit, and she sent them home with a phone number and a name and the knowledge that someone had actually heard them. There was a man named Wallace, 76, a retired fisherman, whose daughter had persuaded him to add her name to the deed of his house so she could help manage things, and who had come home one afternoon to find a for sale sign in the yard and a letter from a realtor saying the property was under contract. Wallace sat at the center table and held his coffee with both hands and didn't speak for 15 minutes. Thelma sat across from him and didn't speak either. When he was ready, he told her what had happened, and she listened the way she had learned to listen in the months since she arrived in Crestfall, without trying to fix it, without offering platitudes, without comparing his story to hers. Just listening. Then she picked up the phone and called the attorney the center kept on retainer 2 days a week, and within an hour Wallace had an appointment and a clear explanation of his legal options and the look on his face of a man who had walked into a building expecting nothing and walked out with something he had forgotten existed. Hope, not the grand dramatic kind, the small practical kind. The kind that says someone knows what happened to you and someone is going to help you fight. There was a woman, 81, who came in with a grocery bag full of unopened mail because she had stopped opening envelopes after her husband died because every envelope contained either a bill she couldn't pay or a condolence card that made her cry, and she hadn't been able to face either. Thelma sat with her and opened every envelope one by one, sorting them into piles. Urgent, important, can wait, doesn't matter. It took 2 hours. The woman left with 3 phone numbers, a payment plan for her utility bill, and the knowledge that the pile of mail that had been growing on her kitchen counter for 4 months was not in fact going to destroy her life. This was the work. Not grand, not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that makes the news or wins awards or gets you invited to speak at conferences. It was the work of sitting with people in their worst moments and helping them find the next step. Thelma was good at it for the same reason she had been good at catering.